I'm Dr. Mark Hatala, and I want to welcome you to my office. I'm a cognitive scientist who studies time travel by replicating days from the past. So everything that someone who was alive on a particular day would have been exposed to, from early morning newspapers through late night television and everything in between. The day we're talking about for this video is February 9th, 1964. That's my Paul McCartney imitation. Well, that's the first appearance of the Beatles on the Ed Sullivan Show. And what we're going to talk about today is the Atlantic and the New Yorker from February 1964. So let's get started with the Atlantic. So the Atlantic has been around since 1857, and it's really written for a general reader. And there's two articles that I think are really interesting that I wanted to talk about. The first one's about JFK. So President Kennedy was assassinated on November 22nd, 1963. And the Atlantic hired a Harvard professor, a Harvard history professor, to write a eulogy for him, putting him in context, and so that what people in the future would think was important about his presidency. And it's interesting because of what he leaves out. So, for example, I think today historians would agree that things like the Cuban Missile Crisis were hugely important, because that really, during the Cold War, that's the closest we came to a nuclear exchange with the Soviet Union. Not mentioned at all. The escalation of the war in Vietnam, also not mentioned. And the civil rights movement is only discussed in terms of how JFK had difficulty with Southern Democrats in getting them to adopt his views on civil rights legislation. I think the biggest miss, though, is the space program. And so JFK had talked about how we're going to land a man on the moon. He literally said man on the moon in within a decade. And we did. And it was actually 5 years after this article, this eulogy was written. And there's no mention of it whatsoever. And so that's, I think, significant. The other article is called Invasion of Privacy. And it asks an interesting question, and I'll actually read the quote to you. Are there now forces loose in our world that threaten to annihilate everyone's privacy? Yes, in our world there certainly are, because I can say, okay, Google, and it will answer any question. There's also Siri and you name it. And so these devices which listen to us all the time. What they were concerned about in 1964 was surveillance cameras in public places, that would eliminate privacy. If you go to any large city in the United States or Europe, I just haven't been anywhere else, there are surveillance cameras all over the place, and they're running all the time. They're ubiquitous. And so this issue of privacy seems to be something that people discuss in different times, in different contexts. And so it's significant in that way. Let's turn to the New Yorker. And so this is the February 8th edition of the New Yorker. And it's a great picture. It's done by Art Birnbaum. He did over 200 covers for the New Yorker. And all the time surrounded by his 15 cats. And so I ask my students this question too. At what point does one go from cat enthusiast to crazy cat person? And so 15 cats is a lot of cats to have in your house. Usually students say it's that fourth cat that's the tipping point, but your mileage may vary. There's two things that I want to talk about in this edition of the New Yorker. One is the cartoons, because I don't understand most of the cartoons in the New Yorker, but a lot of them are timeless. And so sometimes they have to do with things like fashion and what looks good and what doesn't. And other times they have to do with things like business. And so in terms of like biotech companies, you call the press, and I'll call my broker. And so I think those are kind of interesting and funny. The other article that I thought was great is called The Honored Society. And this is a very long article. The New Yorker is kind of famous for doing long-form stories, but it's about the Mafia in Sicily that the U.S. military encountered in 1943 during World War II. And it gets into things like, it explores the vendettas that started in the 1870s, and it tries to explain how they played out and were still relevant in Sicily in 1943 and through 1964 for that matter. Also prominent is the city of Corleone, which again seems insignificant in 1964, but we eventually have Vito Corleone and Michael Corleone in the Godfather movies, which would come out 8 years later. And so it's a very interesting article. It's a long read though. But I'll put links to all of these below so you can read them for yourself at timetravelsimplified.com. And while you're there, why not buy my book, Beatles in America, February 9th, 1964, and become a time traveler yourself. It's guaranteed. Our motto is, it's time travel or it's free. I put a link below also to my Patreon account if you'd like to support my research. And I'd ask you to like and subscribe and share this video. And otherwise, have a great day.